The wind had teeth, and it was biting hard at the high lonesome of Devil's Ridge. Eli Granger felt it through his wool coat, a cold that didn't just chill the skin but sank deep into a man's bones, reminding him that the world cared little for his warmth or his life. He rode with his head down, the brim of his hat pulled low against the stinging promise of snow in the air. His horse, a steady gray gelding named Flint, picked its way through the iron-hard ruts of the trail, its breath pluming in the frigid air. He was not looking for trouble. At 34, Eli had seen enough trouble to last him a lifetime. He was looking for 2 head of cattle, a heifer and a young bull, that had not come down from the high pasture with the rest of the herd before the first freeze. It was a fool's errand. Likely. Wolves had been bold this season, their howls a nightly sermon from the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. Still, a man could not just let his stock vanish without a look. It was not in his nature. He found the heifer first, or what was left of her. The sight soured the meager breakfast in his gut. It was not the work of wolves. Wolves were hungry, not cruel. They killed to eat, leaving scattered bones and hide. This was different. The animal was torn apart, but not for meat. It was a violation, a display of malice left for the buzzards and the cold. Eli dismounted, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He scanned the clearing, his eyes missing nothing. The ground was too frozen for clear tracks, but he saw the disturbed earth, the unnatural stillness. The bull was nearby, in a similar state, its life spilled onto the frozen ground in a dark, meaningless stain. A profound unease settled over him. This was not the work of any beast he knew. This was man's work. A warning, perhaps, or just the senseless cruelty of a passing evil. He had a mind to turn back, to ride hard for his solitary cabin and bolt the door. But something else caught his eye, a flicker of darkness against the pale bark of a lone aspen at the edge of the clearing. It was not a shadow. It was too solid. His rifle felt heavy and right in his hands as he moved forward, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The wind hissed through the bare branches of the trees, a lonely, desolate sound. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a man, or the ruin of one, tied to a wooden post that had been driven deep into the ground. The man was stripped to the waist, his skin a pale, bruised canvas against the gray day. His head hung forward, a tangle of dark hair obscuring his face. His wrists were bound tight to the post with rawhide that had cut deep, the blood frozen in dark rivulets down his arms. His hands were swollen and purple-black, the frost already claiming them. His body was a road map of brutality, a collection of deep bruises and bloody scrapes. He looked dead. Another piece of meat left to rot in the unforgiving wilderness. Eli stopped a dozen feet away, the rifle held loose at his side. He had seen death in many forms. He had seen men hanged, shot, and broken by the sheer hardness of the land. But this was a thing apart. This was a man being erased from the world, slowly and with great suffering, a public spectacle for an audience of none but the circling hawks and the indifferent sky. He almost turned away. It was not his affair. The West was full of men who ran afoul of someone with a stronger arm or a deeper grudge. Getting involved was a sure way to find yourself tied to the next post. He had his own ghosts to mind, his own solitude to protect. He had built his life like a fortress, stone by silent stone, and he did not welcome visitors, living or dead. But then the man's head lifted. It was a slow, agonizing movement, as if pulling a great weight from the bottom of a well. The tangled hair fell away from a face that was all sharp angles and deep shadows. His eyes found Eli's. They were a strange color, a pale, startling silver, like a winter sky just before a storm. They were exhausted, filled with a world of pain, but in their depths, a single, defiant ember still glowed. The man's lips, cracked and blue, parted, a dry, rasping whisper, barely louder than the wind, drifted across the frozen clearing. "Please, just make it quick." The words were not a plea for mercy. They were a request for a courtesy, an appeal from one man to another to finish a job that had been so cruelly started. The sound of it snagged on something inside Eli's chest, something he thought had frozen solid years ago. He saw the finality in the stranger's gaze, the acceptance of an end he now craved, and Eli hesitated. His instinct, honed by years of solitude and survival, screamed at him to ride away. His judgment, scarred by the memory of what happened to men who stood out, warned him to leave this broken thing to its fate. But he did not move. He stood there, the cold wind wrapping around them both, and looked into the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. He saw the ghost of another man in that gaze, another man condemned and abandoned. His brother, Daniel, with a curse that was lost to the wind. Eli strode forward. He leaned his rifle against the post and pulled the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. The stranger's eyes watched him, unblinking, expecting the blade to go into his heart. Instead, Eli sawed at the rawhide bindings. The frozen leather was tough, and it took effort, his breath clouding in front of him. When the first wrist came free, the man's arm fell limp and useless at his side. He did the other. Then the ropes around his chest. The man slumped forward, a dead weight. Eli caught him before he hit the ground. The shock of the cold, bruised skin against his hands startling him. The man was lighter than he looked, all bone and sinew, and he smelled of sweat and old blood. He managed to get the stranger draped over Flint's saddle, a miserable, unconscious burden. The ride back to the cabin was slow and silent, broken only by the rhythmic plod of the horse and the low groans that escaped the stranger's lips. The sky grew heavy and bruised, and the first hard flakes of snow began to fall, sharp and dry against Eli's face. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was solid, built of thick logs he had cut and placed himself. It was a shelter against the world, and he had just brought the world inside. He laid the man on the cot by the hearth, the only bed he had besides his own rough bunk. The stranger's breathing was shallow, a faint rattle in his chest. For the next few hours, Eli worked with a grim, methodical purpose. He stoked the fire until the room was thick with warmth. He stripped the man of his ruined trousers and boots, his movements careful and impersonal. He fetched the basin and a bar of lye soap, cleaning the blood and grime from the man's body. The wounds were extensive. His ribs were a landscape of purple and black. His back was cross-hatched with lashes from a whip or a branch. His hands were the worst, swollen and lifeless. Eli knew enough about frostbite to know the man might lose them. He wrapped them gently in clean rags, his touch surprisingly steady. He hid the man's weapons. A Colt revolver and a long, wicked-looking knife were in a saddlebag that had been left near the post. Eli took them, along with a worn leather gun belt, and stored them in the locked chest at the foot of his bunk. He did not know who this man was, but he was not a fool. He brewed a thin broth of salted beef and herbs, and when the stranger stirred, Eli lifted his head and spooned the warm liquid into his mouth. The man swallowed weakly, his silver eyes clouded with fever and confusion. He did not speak. He did not give a name. He just watched Eli with that same unnerving, silent intensity. It was in the saddlebag, while looking for anything that might identify him, that Eli found it. Tucked into a side pocket was a piece of paper, folded and crumpled, stained with something dark. He smoothed it out on the rough-hewn table. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was a crude but recognizable likeness of the man now lying on his cot. Below the image, stark black letters spelled out a name and a crime. Caleb Wyatt, wanted for the murder of Jonathan Sutter, son of Judge Lawrence Sutter. And below that, the price. Reward, $500, dead or alive. $500. Eli stared at the words. It was more money than he saw in a year. It was enough to buy a new bull, to fix the roof, to last him through 2 hard winters. It was a fortune. All he had to do was ride into town and tell Marshal Thompson what he had found. Or, easier still, He could put a bullet in the man sleeping by his fire and deliver a body, dead or alive. The poster made no distinction. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the rough paper crackling in the quiet room. He should do it. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. This Caleb Wyatt was a killer, a man who had murdered a judge's son. He was dangerous. He had brought a storm of trouble to Eli's door, and the easiest way to end that storm was to collect the reward. But as he looked at the man on the cot, at the defenseless slope of his shoulder, and the flicker of pain that crossed his face, even in sleep, Eli saw Daniel again. He saw his younger brother, not yet 20, standing on a hastily built scaffold, a rough rope around his neck. Daniel had not been a murderer. His only crime had been to love the wrong person, to be caught in a hayloft with the sheriff's son. There had been no trial, just whispers, then shouts, then a mob fueled by righteousness and hate. They had called it justice. Eli had called it a lynching. He remembered the faces in the crowd, the good people of the town, their features twisted with a righteous fury as they spat on his family's name. He remembered standing helpless, a boy of 16, watching the life leave his brother's eyes. He had left town not long after, carrying a hatred for that kind of mob justice that burned colder and deeper than any winter. Now, here was another man, judged and condemned, left to die on a post. Maybe this Caleb Wyatt was a murderer. Maybe he deserved to hang. But something in Eli, the part of him that still mourned his brother, could not be the one to hand him over. He could not be a part of that machine. He opened the door to the firebox on his cast-iron stove and shoved the wanted poster inside. He watched until the edges curled and blackened, until the name Caleb Wyatt and the promise of $500 turned to ash. He had made his choice. 2 days later, the man finally spoke. The fever had broken, but he was still weak, his hands wrapped in their clean bandages. Eli was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. "You should have left me to die." The voice was a raw croak, hoarse from disuse. Eli did not look up from his work. He pushed a cleaning rod down the barrel of the rifle, his movements precise and unhurried. "Maybe I should have," he said, his own voice flat. "Too late now." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, a thing with its own weight. The next morning, a rider came. Eli saw him from the window. A stout man on a stout horse making his way up the track to the cabin, Marshal Thompson. Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He threw a thick blanket over the sleeping form on the cot, hiding him completely. The marshal was a man who enjoyed his authority. He dismounted with a grunt and stomped his boots on the porch. "Granger," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Eli opened the door. "Marshal, what brings you all the way out here?" "Looking for strays, both the four-legged and the two-legged kind," Thompson said, his eyes scanning the inside of the cabin. "Heard you lost some cattle up on the ridge." "Found what was left of them," Eli said, blocking the doorway with his body. "Wolves got 'em, picked clean." The lie came easier than he expected. It felt smooth and solid in his mouth. Thompson's gaze was sharp. "Wolves, you say? Not cougar, not something else?" "Just bones and hide. Marshal, looked like wolf work to me." The marshal grunted, not entirely convinced. "Well, you keep an eye out. There's a fugitive thought to be in these parts. Man named Wyatt, killed Judge Sutter's boy over in Clarion County. There's a handsome reward." "I'll keep that in mind," Eli said, his face a mask of indifference. After a few more questions, Thompson finally left, his suspicion a palpable thing left hanging in the air. Eli closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. From the cot, 2 silver eyes watched him from over the edge of the blanket. That evening, the snow that had been threatening for days finally arrived. It came down in a thick, silent curtain, burying the world in white. For days, they were trapped. The cabin, once Eli's sanctuary, became a cage, The silence between them stretched and strained. It was a living thing, filled with the scrape of a fork on a plate, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind against the logs. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate grace. Two predators sharing a den, wary and watchful. The nights were the worst. Caleb, Eli had started calling him that in his own mind, was haunted. He would cry out in his sleep. Guttural sounds of terror that made the hair on Eli's arms stand up. Sometimes he would thrash, his body reliving some unseen violence. Eli would get up from his bunk and sit in the chair by the fire. Listening, he would not go to the man. He would not offer comfort. He would simply sit and bear witness, a silent sentinel in the dark, until the screaming stopped, and the only sound was Caleb's ragged breathing. During the day, they existed in their own separate orbits. Eli would tend to his chores, feeding the horse in the small lean-to, chopping wood, mending tack. Caleb would sit by the fire, his bandaged hands resting uselessly in his lap, his gaze distant, but Eli felt the man's eyes on him. When he was at the stove, he felt the weight of Caleb's stare on his back. When he looked up from his plate, he would find those silver eyes on him, full of questions that were never asked. And Eli looked back. He found himself watching Caleb, studying the hard lines of his face, the way a muscle jumped in his jaw when the wind rattled the window pane. He saw the deep, abiding pain in the man, a pain that mirrored the one he carried inside himself. There was a terrible sort of kinship in it, a recognition that passed between them without a word. They were both scarred men, branded by a past they could not outrun. On the 7th night of the snow, the tension finally broke. Eli was cleaning a skillet by the fire, his back to the cot. The cabin was quiet, the storm outside having finally eased. He felt a presence behind him and turned. Caleb was standing there, unsteady on his feet, his face pale in the flickering firelight. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but the words would not come. Instead, he lifted his hand, the one that was less damaged, and reached out. His fingers, trembling slightly, brushed against the rough wool of Eli's shirt sleeve. It was a feather-light touch, hesitant and uncertain, but it sent a jolt through Eli, sharp and unexpected. It was a touch of shocking intimacy in their world of silence and distance. For a second, a whole world of unspoken things passed between them, of loneliness, of fear, of a desperate, aching need. Then, just as quickly, Caleb pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. A look of shame, sharp and profound, crossed his face. He turned without a word and retreated to the cot, pulling the blanket up to his chin, his back to the room. Eli stood frozen by the fire, the skillet still in his hand. He could feel the phantom sensation of those fingers on his arm, a single point of heat in the cold room. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his bunk, staring up at the dark ceiling, the silence of the cabin pressing down on him. But it was not Caleb he was thinking of. He was thinking of Daniel. He was remembering the day after the hanging, when his mother had finally broken her silence, weeping into her apron while his father sat staring at the wall, his face carved from stone. He remembered walking into town for supplies and feeling the weight of the townsfolk's stares. He heard their whispers, the ugly words that followed him down the street. They spat on the ground as he passed. They had not just killed his brother. They had tried to erase his family, to cover them in a shame so thick it would suffocate them. He had learned then that there were things people hated more than murder. He had learned that a man's life could be worth less than a rumor. And as he lay there, listening to the soft, troubled breathing of the fugitive in his cabin, he knew he would not let it happen again. The snow fell for a week. It was a silent, patient siege, piling in great drifts against the cabin door and windows, burying the familiar landscape under a blank page of white. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the lean-to for the horses, and the narrow path Eli kept shoveled between them. Inside, the passing of days was marked by the dwindling supplies, The sack of flour grew limp. The last of the coffee was boiled until it was little more than bitter, colored water, and the salted pork was cut into ever thinner slices. A new kind of tension, sharp and practical, settled in alongside the heavy silence. Hunger gnawed at the edges of their confinement. It was during one of these meager meals, staring at the 3 slices of pork on his plate, that Caleb spoke of it. The words came out low and rough, as if dredged from a deep place. "He deserved it," he said, not looking at Eli, but at the fire. "The judge's son." Eli stopped chewing. He laid his fork down carefully, making no sound. He had wondered, of course. He had imagined 100 scenarios, a bar fight gone wrong, a dispute over cards, or a woman. He waited. "He was a poison," Caleb continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "A sickness that walked like a man. Killing him was like putting down a rabid dog. It was a service." He offered nothing more. No details. No justification beyond the cold finality of his words. He did not deny the act. He claimed it, but the reason remained his own. A locked room inside him. Eli did not press. He knew the look of a man who had walled off a part of himself. He had walls of his own. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and picked up his fork again. The subject was closed. Eli took to cutting wood with a fierce, restless energy, if only to be out of the cabin, to feel the bite of the cold air in his lungs and the satisfying thud of the axe into frozen timber. From the woodpile, he could see the cabin window. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of Caleb moving inside, a shadow behind the glass. The man was growing stronger. The bruises on his torso were fading from violent purple to a mottled yellow-green. He had started to walk around the small space, a pronounced limp in his right leg where a deep gash was slowly mending. But he was still a wounded animal. He flinched at the sound of the axe splitting a log, his head jerking up, his body tensing for a blow. He never let Eli walk behind him. If Eli entered the cabin, Caleb would turn, always keeping him in his line of sight, his silver eyes watchful and guarded. One afternoon, as Eli swung the axe, the rhythmic motion hypnotizing him, the memories came for him. They often did in the winter, when the world was quiet and there was nothing to distract him from the ghosts he carried. He was not in the snow-covered yard of his ranch anymore. He was 16 again, standing in the dust of the main street, the summer sun beating down on his head. Daniel, his brother, had always been different. Where Eli was quiet and grounded, Daniel was like sunlight on water, full of laughter and a bright, careless beauty that drew people in. He loved music and stray dogs and the color of the sky at dusk. And he loved Thomas Miller, the sheriff's son. It had been a secret thing, a truth whispered in haylofts and shared on long rides in the hills, far from the prying eyes of the town. Eli had known, Daniel had told him once, his face alight with a joy so pure and fierce it had frightened Eli. He did not understand it, this bond between his brother and Thomas, but he understood the love. He saw it in the way Daniel's eyes would find Thomas across a crowded room, a silent conversation passing between them. The secret did not last. A stable hand, a bitter man named Peterson, saw them. He did not see love. He saw something to be twisted, something to be used as a weapon. The whispers started in the saloon, ugly and venomous. They spread through the town like a contagion, passed between housewives over laundry lines and between men sharpening their tools. The words they used were foul, words that stripped the beauty from what Daniel and Thomas had, leaving only something sordid and unnatural in their place. The mob came at twilight. They were not monsters. They were the town's good folk, the blacksmith, the store owner, the farmers from the surrounding homesteads. Their faces, usually familiar and placid, were transformed by a shared, righteous fury. They dragged Daniel from the family's small house. Eli tried to stop them, a boy against a tide of men, and was thrown aside, his head hitting the hard-packed earth. He watched, dizzy and helpless, as they hauled his brother toward the great oak in the center of town. They had already been to the sheriff's house. Thomas was there, his face beaten, a rope already around his neck. The sheriff, his own father, stood on his porch and did nothing, his face a mask of stone and shame. They hanged them side by side. There was no trial, no judge, no law. There was only the roar of the crowd and the creak of the ropes. Eli remembered the terrible silence that fell as his brother's body went still. He remembered the townsfolk turning away, their duty done, their town cleansed. They walked past him, some with pity in their eyes, most with a cold satisfaction. Justice had been served. The axe bit deep into the log, splitting it with a loud crack. Eli shuddered, the cold sweat on his back colder than the snow. He leaned on the axe handle, breathing hard, the ghost of his brother's face hanging in the winter air. He understood now, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, why he had cut Caleb down from that post. He was not saving a murderer. He was saving a man from a mob. His brooding was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. It was not the sound of a single rider. He looked up, his hand instinctively going to the pistol tucked into his belt. 3 men were riding up the track. He recognized them. Silas Croft and the Hemlock brothers, ranchers from the valley. Men he shared a nod with in town, but never a word more. They were not here for a social call. Eli stood his ground by the woodpile as they reined in their horses. Caleb, he knew, would be inside, hidden, listening. "Granger," Silas said. His face was chapped red by the wind, his eyes small and suspicious. "Long winter." "It is that," Eli replied, his voice even. "Marshall was saying you found some dead cattle." One of the Hemlock brothers, Levi, chimed in. "Said it was wolves." "That's what I said. Funny thing is," Silas continued, leaning on his saddle horn, "me and the boys here, we was tracking a cougar up on that same ridge just before the snow hit. We found a camp. Looked like someone left in a hurry. Found a dead horse, shot, and we found blood on the ground. A lot of it, not horse blood." Eli's face remained a mask. "That's so?" "Yeah," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the cabin. "That's so. Marshall also said there's a fugitive about. Man who killed a judge's son? A real nasty piece of work. $500 reward." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Man like that, wounded. He'd be looking for a place to hole up. Someplace remote, someplace solitary. The threat was unspoken, but clear. They knew, or they suspected, which was just as dangerous. They were fishing, trying to see if he would bite. "I haven't seen anyone," Eli said, his voice flat and cold as a stone at the bottom of a creek. "I've been snowed in, same as everyone else. If you gentlemen are done stating the obvious, I have wood to chop." Silas Croft stared at him for a long moment. His eyes narrowed. Then he spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "You always were a strange one. Granger, just like your brother." The mention of Daniel was like a punch to the gut, but Eli's expression did not flicker. He met Silas's gaze without wavering until the other man finally looked away. Let's go." Silas grunted to the others. They turned their horses, their suspicion left behind like a foul smell on the clean winter air. Eli watched them until they were out of sight, his hand still resting on the butt of his pistol. He did not relax until they were gone. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The visit from the ranchers had changed something, solidifying the invisible wall between them and the outside world. They were truly alone now. 2 men against the judgment of the frontier. For the first time, Caleb made a move to help. Eli was heading out to the lean-to to feed the horses, a nightly ritual. "I can help," Caleb said. His voice was still rough, but it was the first time he had offered anything. Eli hesitated, then nodded. "All right." The lean-to was small, smelling of hay and horse. Flint nickered softly as Eli approached, but the mare, a skittish creature he'd bought a year ago and never fully tamed, shied away, her eyes rolling in the lantern light. Eli had been patient with her, but she remained distrustful, scarred by a previous owner's heavy hand. Caleb moved past him, his limp more pronounced in the thick bedding of straw. He did not approach the mare directly. He stood near the wall, murmuring to her. His voice was low and soft, a stark contrast to his usual grim silence. He spoke nonsense words, a gentle, rhythmic sound. The mare's ears twitched. She stopped her nervous pacing and watched him. Slowly, he moved closer, his hand outstretched, palm up. He did not carry the scent of fear or aggression. He carried only a quiet stillness. After a long moment, the mare stretched her neck and nudged his hand with her soft nose. Eli watched, captivated. He saw Caleb's hands, the ones that were still healing, the fingers still stiff and scarred, stroke the mare's neck with a tenderness that was breathtaking. These were the hands of a man wanted for murder. Yet they possessed a gentleness that could soothe a broken animal. It was a contradiction that settled deep in Eli's chest, confusing and profound. They stood in the quiet of the barn, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The only sounds were the soft munching of the horses and the whisper of the wind outside. It felt like the world had fallen away, leaving only this small pocket of peace. "You have a way with them," Eli said, his voice quiet. Caleb did not look away from the horse. "They know," he said. "They can smell the truth on a man. They know who to trust." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. They were not talking about horses anymore. "Have you ever wanted something so much you let it ruin you?" Caleb asked, his gaze finally leaving the mare to find Eli's in the dim light. The question was raw, stripped of all pretense. It was a piece of his soul laid bare on the straw-covered floor. Eli felt the truth of it in his own bones. He thought of his brother, of the love that had cost him his life. He thought of his own solitary existence, a life built on the ruins of that loss. "Once," Eli replied, his voice thick. "It did." The space between them seemed to shimmer with a powerful, invisible energy. Caleb took a step closer. The air grew thin, hard to breathe. He stopped in front of Eli. So close, Eli could see the flicker of the lantern flame reflected in his silver eyes. He saw the pain there, the exhaustion, but he also saw a flicker of something else, something desperate and hungry. Then Caleb leaned in and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was brief and clumsy, a collision of chapped lips and unspoken desperation. It was trembling with fear and a lifetime of loneliness. It tasted of salt and sorrow. And then, as quickly as it had happened, it was over. Caleb pulled back, a look of horror and shame on his face. He turned and stumbled out of the barn, a dark silhouette against the moonlit snow. For a moment, Eli was frozen. His mind reeled. The touch of Caleb's lips lingered on his, a spark in the cold. Then a wave of something hot and powerful crashed through him. Anger, confusion, and a fierce, undeniable recognition. He strode out of the barn into the biting cold. Caleb had not gone far. He was standing in the middle of the yard, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed against the vast, indifferent night. "What was that?" Eli demanded, his voice harsh. Caleb did not turn. "A mistake. Forget it happened." "I don't think I can." Eli grabbed his arm, spinning him around. "You don't get to do that and then walk away." "Leave it be! Granger!" Caleb snarled, his eyes flashing with a wild, cornered animal fear. "You should have turned me in. You should have shot me. It would have been better." "Why?" Eli's grip tightened. "Because you'd rather be dead than... what? Be this? Be here with me?" The hurt in his own voice surprised him. The argument was a whirlwind of everything they had not said for weeks. It was the fear of the posse, the weight of their pasts, the fire of their shared confinement, all crashing together in the frozen yard. "You don't know what you are doing," Caleb said, his voice breaking. You don't know what they will do to you for helping me. For this, I know exactly what they do, Eli shot back, his voice raw with the memory of the oak tree. I have seen it. He pulled Caleb closer, his face inches away. He saw the fight in Caleb's eyes, but beneath it, he saw the same aching loneliness that resided in his own heart. He did not think, he acted. He closed the distance between them and kissed him again. This kiss was not like the first. There was no hesitation. It was a raw, desperate claiming. It was the release of all the tension, the fear, the silent longing. It was a kiss that did not ask for permission, a kiss that demanded to be felt. Caleb resisted for a moment, his body stiff with shame and fear. But then, with a broken sob, he melted against Eli, his hands coming up to grip Eli's coat. The kiss deepened, becoming a desperate search for warmth in a world that had offered them none. They ended up back in the cabin, shedding their cold, wet clothes in a trail from the door to Eli's bunk. There were no words. There was no need for them. They came together in a tangle of limbs and silence, a collision of scarred skin and wounded souls. It was not gentle. It was a raw, elemental thing, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. It was two men, branded by tragedy and judged by the world. Finding a desperate sanctuary in each other's arms, they clung to each other as if the world were trying to tear them apart, their bodies speaking a language of pain and solace that words could never touch. Afterward, they lay tangled in the rough blankets, the firelight painting their bodies in shades of orange and gold. Eli listened to the sound of Caleb's breathing, steady now in sleep, and felt a profound and terrifying shift inside him. The fortress he had built around his heart had been breached. He was no longer just a man hiding a fugitive. He was bound to this person in a way that went deeper than law or reason. In the gray light of morning, Eli woke to find the other side of the bunk empty. A moment of panic seized him before he saw Caleb standing by the table. He was dressed, his back to Eli, staring down at something in his hand. Eli got up, pulling on his trousers, and went to him. Caleb opened his palm. Lying there, folded into a small, worn square, was the wanted poster. Eli realized with a jolt that he had burned a copy he had found in town for his own supplies. But Caleb had kept his original. It was a testament, a prayer, a death sentence he carried with him. "They'll never let me live," Caleb said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. He was not looking at Eli, but at the crude drawing of his own face. Eli reached out and closed Caleb's fingers over the poster, his hand covering Caleb's. The touch was warm, steady. "Then we don't let them find you," Eli answered, his voice firm with a conviction he had not felt in years. He was not just saying words. He was making a vow. The snow receded slowly, grudgingly, melting away in patches to reveal the pale, dead grass of winter. The world outside the cabin began to expand again, and with it came a fragile, unspoken peace. A routine settled over them, quiet and domestic. Caleb, his strength returning with each passing day, began to take on his share of the work. He mended the section of fence near the barn that had been brought down by the weight of the snow, his movements still stiff but sure. He learned the temperaments of the horses, the quiet strength of Flint and the nervous energy of the mare, who now followed him like a shadow. They worked in a comfortable silence, two men moving in a shared orbit, but the quiet was punctuated by small, stolen moments that held more meaning than 1,000 words. A brief touch of hands as Eli passed Caleb a tool, a shared glance across the fire at night that held the heat of their tangled limbs in the dark. In the cold privacy of the barn, there were stolen kisses, quick and desperate, tasting of the cold air and the unspoken fear that was their constant companion. They were living on borrowed time, and they both knew it. The peace was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river, and they were careful not to test its weight. When the last of the flour was gone and the salt pork was just a memory, Eli knew he could not put it off any longer. He had to go to town for supplies. The thought of it settled like a stone in his gut. "I'll be back before nightfall," he said to Caleb, trying to keep his voice casual. Caleb just nodded, his face impassive, but Eli saw the flicker of anxiety in his silver eyes. He was polishing a piece of tack, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate motion. "Be careful," was all he said. The ride to town was tense. Eli felt exposed under the vast, open sky. Every rider he saw in the distance made his hand drift to the pistol at his hip. The town of Redemption had not changed. It was the same collection of dusty streets and false-fronted buildings, populated by the same people who had condemned his brother. As he tied Flint to the hitching post outside the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. The stares were not subtle. They were direct, measuring, full of a cold curiosity. He heard the whispers behind his back as he walked down the boardwalk. The name Granger, a low hiss in the air. Inside the store, Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, gave him a tight, forced smile. "Eli, been a while. Tough winter." "It was," Eli said, handing him the list. He kept his replies short, his gaze neutral. He did not want to invite conversation. He just wanted to get his supplies and leave. While Abernathy gathered the flour, beans, and coffee, Eli's eyes scanned the room. And then he saw it, nailed to the wall by the door, next to an advertisement for patent medicine, a new wanted poster. It was fresh, the paper still clean. The drawing of Caleb was the same, but the words beneath it had changed. The reward had been doubled, $1,000, and beneath the sum, 2 stark words had been added: "Dead preferred." A cold rage, clean and sharp, sliced through him. It was not just about justice anymore. It was a bounty, an invitation for any man with a gun and an empty purse to hunt Caleb down like an animal. He waited until Abernathy's back was turned. Then he walked to the door, pulled the poster from the wall with a single, sharp tug that tore the paper, folded it quickly, and shoved it deep into his coat pocket. He paid for his supplies, his face a grim mask, and left the store without another word. The ride home was a blur of righteous fury. He pushed Flint harder than he should have. The need to get back to the cabin, to the small sanctuary he had built, a burning ache in his chest. He found Caleb by the woodpile, splitting the last of the logs he had cut before the big snow. He looked up as Eli rode in, a question in his eyes. Eli dismounted, unloaded the supplies, and then pulled the crumpled poster from his pocket. He did not say a word. He just held it out. Caleb took it, his face paling as he read the new words. He stared at it for a long time, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to the cabin. Eli followed. He watched as Caleb opened the door to the stove, the same way Eli had done with the first poster, and fed the paper to the flames. They stood together and watched it burn. The promise of $1,000 turning into black, weightless ash. That night, the story came out. They were sitting by the fire, the silence between them heavier than ever. "His name was Samuel," Caleb said suddenly, his voice low and strained. He was staring into the flames as if the memories were playing out in the shifting embers. "He was 17. He worked at the livery in Clarion. A good kid, quiet. Saved his money because he wanted to go to California and see the ocean." Eli remained silent, listening. Judge Sutter's son, Jonathan. He was a rot at the core. Everyone knew it, but no one said it, not out loud. The judge was too powerful. Jonathan had appetites. He liked young men. Boys, really. He would find the ones who were poor, the ones who had no one to speak for them. He'd promise them money, or threaten them. It didn't matter. He'd get them to come to these gatherings he held, out in an old hunting lodge deep in the woods. Caleb's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his hands were clenched into tight fists in his lap. "I don't know all of what happened at that lodge. The boys who went, they never spoke of it. They came back, changed, hollowed out. You could see the shame in their eyes, the way they walked with their heads down. Samuel went. Jonathan promised him a whole month's wages for one night's work, a fast way to get to California. He paused, swallowing hard. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Samuel never came back from that lodge. They found him 3 days later down by the river. They said he fell and hit his head. A tragic accident. But I saw his body before the undertaker fixed him up. I saw the marks on him. It was no accident. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. Jonathan Sutter and his friends, they used him up and threw him away, and the judge made sure it was all forgotten. No investigation, no questions, just a quiet burial for a poor stable boy. Caleb finally looked at Eli, his silver eyes blazing with a cold, dead fire. I was there at the burial. I saw Samuel's mother, a widow who had already buried 2 other children, weeping over that small grave. I saw Judge Sutter there, offering his condolences, his face a mask of false sympathy. And I saw Jonathan, standing behind his father, with a smirk on his face. He was untouchable. He knew it. He took a deep, shuddering breath. So I took justice into my own hands. I waited for him. I found him alone on the road from the saloon a week later. I told him I knew what he did to Samuel. He just laughed. He called me a liar and pulled a gun. But I was faster. He looked down at his own hands. I killed him. I don't regret it. That boy deserved to die. I only regret that I was the one who had to do it. He fell silent. The confession hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Eli felt a surge of rage so powerful it made him tremble. It was not directed at Caleb. It was for the boy, Samuel. It was for Jonathan Sutter and his father, and a world that allowed the powerful to prey on the weak. He saw the fear that was still lodged deep in Caleb's bones, the trauma of what he had seen and what he had done. It was the same fear his brother Daniel must have felt, the terror of being at the mercy of men who held all the power and none of the compassion. "You're not a murderer, Caleb," Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did what the law should have—" The words seemed to break something in Caleb. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He quickly wiped it away. But the damage was done. The wall between them had crumbled. They began to talk of running. The idea, once a distant fantasy, now became a desperate, tangible plan. "Mexico," Eli suggested one evening. "We could get some land, a small place. They wouldn't look for us there." "Or California," Caleb said, a ghost of a smile on his face. "I could finally see the ocean." The talk was hopeful, but their actions were filled with a desperate urgency. Their nights together took on a new intensity. They made love with the ferocity of men who knew they could be ghosts by morning, their bodies clinging to each other, seeking a warmth and a solace that the world outside was determined to deny them. It was a fierce, silent communion, a rebellion against the cold, hard certainty of the gallows. Eli started teaching Caleb how to shoot better. He set up tin cans on a fence post at the far end of the pasture, a safe distance from the road. He stood behind Caleb, correcting his stance, showing him how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it, how to lead a moving target. "Your hands are steady," Eli noted, watching as Caleb put a bullet through the center of a can. "You just need to trust your eye." "I'm a better shot with a knife," Caleb admitted, reloading the revolver. "A knife won't do you much good against 3 men with rifles 100 yards away," Eli said grimly. "You'll need this. If we go—" The "if" hung in the air, a reminder of the fragility of their plans. The harbinger of their doom arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a traveling preacher. He was a tall, skeletal man with eyes that were too bright and a smile that did not reach them. He rode a sway-backed mule and carried a Bible that was worn from use. He claimed he had lost his way on the path to the next valley. Eli was instantly wary. He offered the man a dipper of water but did not invite him inside. The preacher, whose name was Reverend Gideon, seemed to see everything. His eyes darted from Eli's guarded face to the cabin, where Caleb was carefully staying out of sight of the window. "A man lives a solitary life out here," the preacher commented, wiping his thin lips with the back of his hand. "It can be a balm for the soul, or it can be a place to hide from the eyes of God and the judgment of men." "I just find it quiet," Eli said, his voice flat. Reverend Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed to sense the tension in the air, the presence of something hidden and unspoken. "Indeed," he said slowly. He handed the dipper back to Eli, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. "May the Lord's grace find you, Mr. Granger, even out here." He turned his mule and rode off, leaving a trail of profound unease behind him. Eli watched him go, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. The preacher had not been lost. He had been looking. 3 days later, they came. Eli was in the barn, mending a piece of harness, when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at a steady, determined pace. He looked out the open barn door and saw them, 5 riders coming up the track. At the front was Marshal Thompson, his face set in a grim, determined line. A posse. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He ran to the cabin. Caleb was at the window, his face pale, his eyes wide with a trapped, hunted look. There was no time for plans, no time for goodbyes. Eli moved on pure instinct. He grabbed a canvas sack and shoved a loaf of bread, a strip of jerky, and a canteen of water into it. He grabbed the rifle from the wall and a box of cartridges. "The hills," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. He pushed the supplies into Caleb's hands. "Go, now. Follow the creek bed up to the high rocks. Stay hidden. Don't light a fire. I'll come for you. I promise." Caleb stared at him, his eyes full of a terrible fear, not for himself, but for Eli. "They'll kill you." "They have to find me first," Eli said, giving him a rough shove toward the back door. "Go!" At the door, Caleb turned and grabbed the front of Eli's shirt, pulling him into a hard, desperate kiss. It was over in a second. "I'll find you," Eli whispered again, his promise a sacred vow. Then Caleb was gone, slipping out the back and disappearing into the scrub and trees that led up to the rocky hills behind the ranch. Eli took a deep breath, schooling his features into a neutral mask. He walked out onto the porch just as the posse rode into his yard. "Granger," the marshal said, swinging down from his horse. The other 4 men, including Silas Croft and the Hemlock brothers, sat on their horses, their hands resting on their rifles. They had formed a half circle, cutting off any escape. "Marshal," Eli said calmly, "to what do I owe the pleasure of so many visitors?" "We can skip the pleasantries," Thompson said, his eyes hard as agates. "We have it on good authority that you are harboring a fugitive, the murderer, Caleb Wyatt. A man of God reported seeing 2 men at this cabin." Eli's heart went cold. The preacher. "A man of God was lost," Eli said, his voice steady. "I gave him a drink of water and sent him on his way. I've been here alone all winter." Silas Croft spat on the ground. "He's lying. Marshal—" Thompson stepped closer to Eli, his face inches away. He was a big man, and he used his size to intimidate. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Granger, where is he?" "I don't know who you're talking about," Eli said, meeting the marshal's gaze without flinching. The first punch came without warning, a hard, brutal blow to his stomach that drove the air from his lungs. Eli doubled over, gasping, before he could recover. Thompson grabbed a handful of his hair and slammed his head back against the thick log wall of the cabin. The world exploded in a flash of white pain. "Lying's a sin, Granger," the sheriff spat, his voice a low growl. "And aiding a killer is a hanging offense. You think protecting that degenerate is worth your own neck?" Eli tasted blood in his mouth. He sagged against the wall, his vision swimming. He could hear the men laughing. "Search the cabin," Thompson ordered. He heard them ransack his home, the sound of his few possessions being thrown to the floor. Through a haze of pain, he pushed himself upright. He had to keep them here. He had to give Caleb time to get away. "He's not in there," Eli grunted, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the snow. Thompson turned back to him, his face flushed with anger. "Then where is he?" He hit Eli again, a hard right to the jaw that snapped his head to the side. Pain flared, bright and blinding. "I told you, I'm alone." Another punch, and another. He fell to his knees in the snow, the cold seeping through his trousers. He could feel his face swelling, his lips split open, but through the pain, a cold, defiant resolve hardened within him. He thought of Daniel, alone and friendless on the scaffold. He thought of Caleb, running for his life in the cold hills. They could beat him. They could kill him, but he would not give them Caleb. He would not be the man who sent another soul to the mob. He lifted his head, bleeding and broken, and stared up at the marshal. He said nothing. His silence was his final, unbreakable shield. He came back at dusk. Eli was lying on the floor by the cold hearth. Having managed to crawl that far from the porch, the world was a swimming haze of pain, and each breath was a fresh agony in his ribs. He had drifted in and out of consciousness, the snow on the porch his only comfort, a cold balm against his swelling face. He heard the door creak open and didn't have the strength to lift his head. Assuming the posse had returned to finish the job, a shadow fell over him. "God damn you, Granger!" a voice rasped. It was a sound of pure fury. Strong hands were on him, surprisingly gentle as they rolled him onto a blanket. Caleb. He had come back. Eli saw his face, a pale, grim mask in the fading light, his silver eyes blazing with a terrifying rage. A low curse tore from Caleb's throat as he saw the full extent of the damage. The split lip, the swollen, blackened eye, the bloody mess of Eli's face. Caleb worked with a silent, furious efficiency. He stoked the fire until it roared, chasing the deep chill from the cabin. He brought a basin of warm water and began to clean Eli's wounds. His movements were sharp, almost violent, but his touch on Eli's skin was incredibly careful. He cleaned the blood away. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped rhythmically. He did not speak. The silence in the cabin was thick with his rage, a dangerous, palpable thing. When he had finished cleaning the cuts, he tore strips from a clean shirt and began to bind Eli's ribs, his hands trembling with a barely suppressed rage. Eli watched him through his one good eye, his mind a dull fog of pain. He had expected Caleb to be long gone, deep in the hills, putting as much distance as possible between himself and this cursed place. But he had come back. He had walked back into the lion's den for a man he barely knew. The thought was a small, warm ember in the cold ruin of his body. It took 2 days for Eli to be able to stand on his own, and another for him to see out of both eyes. The cabin was a wreck. The posse had torn the place apart, overturning the table, throwing his few books to the floor, pulling the blankets from his bunk. Caleb had methodically put it all back together, moving with a quiet anger that never seemed to fade. He cooked for Eli, broth and then stew, and checked his wounds without a word. He was a ghost of fury and terror, tending to the man who had been broken for him. On the third night, something inside Eli finally gave way. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk, the dull throb in his head a constant companion. Caleb was across the room, cleaning the rifle Eli had given him, his movements precise and deadly. The firelight cast long shadows, and in the oppressive quiet, the memories came. He saw Daniel's face, not as he was in life, bright and laughing, but as he was in death, his neck at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide and empty. He saw the faces of the mob, the righteous satisfaction in their eyes. He felt the sting of their spit on his cheek. He felt the marshal's fists, the brutal, casual cruelty of a man who held all the power. The pain of the past and the agony of the present collided within him, a great, crushing wave of despair. A sound tore from his throat, A raw, ugly thing he did not recognize as his own. A wrecking sob. It was the sound of something shattering inside him. The carefully constructed walls of solitude and silence he had built for 18 years crumbling into dust. The sobs came one after another, shaking his entire body, wrenching from a place so deep he thought it had died long ago. He was not just weeping for his broken face or his bruised ribs. He was weeping for his brother, for his lost youth, for the endless aching loneliness of his life. He was weeping for the sheer, unrelenting injustice of the world. He buried his face in his hands, ashamed of the display, of the raw, naked vulnerability. He was a broken man, weeping in the dark. He felt the bunk dip beside him. He did not look up. He felt a hand, hesitant at first, then firm, rest on his back. Caleb did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just sat there, a solid, steady presence in the storm of Eli's grief. He simply held him, his hand a warm anchor in the turbulent darkness. Eli leaned into the touch, his sobs slowly quieting into ragged, shuddering breaths. They sat like that for a long time, two broken men in the firelight, the silence no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. Finally, when the last of the shudders had passed, Caleb spoke, his voice a low whisper, rough with an emotion Eli could not name. "You were the only good thing I found in that hell." The simple words landed with the force of a physical blow. Eli lifted his head, his face a swollen, tear-stained mess, and looked at Caleb. In the silver eyes that had once held only defiance and pain, he saw something else now, something that looked terrifyingly like devotion. The next morning, they made their plan. There was no more talk of if. There was only when and how. "Tonight," Eli said, his voice hoarse. "We leave at nightfall. We ride south and we don't stop." Caleb nodded, his face grim. "What about the ranch?" Eli looked around the small cabin, at the log walls he had raised with his own hands, at the stone hearth where he had spent 1,000 lonely nights. This place was his life's work, his fortress, but it was also a prison, a monument to his grief. It was not a sanctuary anymore. It was a target. "We burn it," Eli said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We leave nothing for them to pick over, nothing to hold us here." A part of his plan required him to seek out the only other person on his land, a young man named Jesse, whom Eli had hired a few months back to help with the herd before winter. Jesse lived in a small, dilapidated bunkhouse a quarter-mile from the main cabin. Eli had not seen him since before the posse arrived, assuming the boy had the good sense to make himself scarce. He found him there, packing a small bag, his eyes wide and fidgety. "I need you to take the rest of the herd and drive them over to Silas Croft's land," Eli instructed, handing him the last of the cash he had in the cabin. "Tell him he can have them. I'm clearing out." Jesse stammered his agreement, his eyes darting everywhere but Eli's bruised face. "Yes, sir, Mr. Granger. I'll do it right away." Eli should have seen it then, the furtive guilt in the boy's eyes, the tremble in his hands as he took the money. But his mind was on the night ahead, on the long ride, on the fire and the escape. He turned his back on the boy and walked away, not realizing he had just sealed their fate. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, they made their final preparations. They saddled Flint and the mare, tying bedrolls and saddlebags packed with food, ammunition, and a few of Eli's father's tools. They moved with a grim, silent purpose. Eli stood in the center of the cabin one last time, the lantern in his hand. He looked at the empty bunk, the cold hearth. He was not just leaving a home, he was leaving a ghost. With a deep breath, he tipped the lantern, spilling the kerosene onto the wooden floorboards. The flames caught with a hungry whoosh, climbing the walls in seconds. He backed out and barred the door from the outside. He met Caleb by the barn. Together, they watched the cabin burn, the flames a roaring, defiant beast against the encroaching darkness. There was no sadness in it, only a fierce, clean sense of release. "It's time," Eli said, turning toward the barn. But a smell on the wind stopped him. It was not just the wood smoke from the cabin. It was something else, acrid, oily, and it was coming from the barn. An unnatural orange glow began to flicker from the gaps in the barn walls. "Get back!" Eli yelled, grabbing Caleb's arm. At that moment, the night exploded. The sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed from the trees beyond the barnyard, the bullet splintering the fence post beside Eli's head. A second shot followed, then a third. They were ambushed. The lawmen had come back. Jesse, the boy, must have ridden straight to the marshal. "Inside!" Caleb shouted, shoving Eli toward the small stone milk house that stood a few yards away. They scrambled behind the low stone wall just as a hail of bullets peppered the spot where they had been standing. The barn was fully engulfed now, the flames leaping high into the night sky, turning the ranch yard into a hellish, flickering stage. "They're in the trees, on the ridge!" Eli gasped, peering over the wall. He could see the muzzle flashes, at least 4 of them. They were pinned down. The fire from the barn was spreading, the heat intense, casting their shadows long and dancing against the stone wall. "We have to make a run for the creek bed," Caleb said, his voice tight. "It's our only way out." Eli knew he was right. He risked a look. The closest cover was a stand of thick pines 50 yards away, across an open stretch of ground illuminated by the fire. It was a suicide run. He chambered around in his rifle. "On 3, Eli said, his heart hammering against his bruised ribs. "I'll draw their fire. You run." "Like hell," Caleb retorted, his silver eyes flashing in the firelight. "We go together." Before Eli could argue, Caleb acted. He stood, fired 2 quick shots from the revolver toward the ridge, then dropped back down behind the wall, as Eli had expected. The move drew an immediate volley of fire toward their position. Bullets ricocheted off the stone, whining into the night. "Now!" Caleb yelled. But Eli was already moving. He broke from cover, running low, his legs pumping, the rifle held tight against his chest. He heard Caleb right behind him. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The roar of the fire, the crack of the rifles, the whistle of bullets passed his ears. He focused on the dark shape of the pines, a promise of safety. He was almost there when a bullet kicked up dirt at his feet, making him stumble. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his calf and went down hard, his rifle flying from his grasp. He tried to get up, but his leg buckled under him. From the ridge, he heard a triumphant shout. "Got one of them!" He saw the figures start to move down from the trees, dark shapes against the fire, coming to finish him off. He was a dead man. Then Caleb was there. He appeared as if from nowhere, standing over Eli, his revolver bucking in his hand. He was not aiming at the men on the ridge. He was firing at the burning barn. He put 3 rounds into a stack of old barrels near the main door. Eli knew what was in them, the last of the kerosene for the lamps. The world erupted in a blinding white flash and a deafening roar. A fireball rolled out of the barn, sending a wave of heat and force across the yard that knocked the advancing lawmen off their feet. In the ringing silence and confusion that followed, Caleb hauled Eli to his feet. "Can you walk?" he yelled over the ringing in Eli's ears. Eli tried to put weight on his leg and cried out in pain. "No!" Without a word, Caleb threw Eli's arm over his shoulders and half dragged, half carried him toward the pines. They were 10 feet from the tree line when another shot rang out, closer this time. Caleb grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and his whole body shuddered. But he did not fall. He pushed them the last few feet into the darkness of the woods. They collapsed behind the thick trunk of a pine tree, gasping for breath. "Are you hit?" Eli asked, his voice raw with panic. "It's nothing," Caleb grunted, but in the dim, flickering light from the fire, Eli could see the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. He was bleeding, badly. They stumbled on through the night, leaving the fire and the shouting men behind them. Eli leaned heavily on Caleb, his own leg a throbbing agony, while Caleb gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder. They pushed themselves deeper into the hills, their only light the terrible orange glow on the horizon, the funeral pyre for the life Eli was leaving behind. They found shelter just before dawn, a shallow cave set into a rock outcropping. Hidden by a thicket of winter bear brush, they collapsed inside, their bodies screaming with pain and exhaustion. Caleb slumped against the cold stone wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. The front of his shirt was soaked with blood. He was burning with fever. Eli tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it hard against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. The bullet had gone clean through, but the wound was ragged. Infection was already setting in. Caleb's breathing was shallow and rapid. As the sun began to rise, casting a weak gray light into the cave, Eli tended to him. He cleaned the wound as best he could with water from his canteen. Caleb was barely conscious, muttering deliriously. Eli felt a cold, familiar dread creep into his heart. He remembered sitting by his brother's bed when they were boys, when Daniel had been stricken with a lung fever. He remembered feeling so helpless, watching the life slowly fade from his brother. Daniel had died alone on a scaffold, without a friendly hand to hold, without a kind word to see him on his way. Eli looked down at Caleb's pale, feverish face. He swore to himself, a silent, desperate vow in the cold, gray dawn. He had failed to save his brother. He would not fail again. He would not let Caleb meet the same end. For 2 days, he fought the fever. He kept the wound clean. He trickled water between Caleb's cracked lips. He sat with him through the long, cold nights, listening to his fevered nightmares, holding him steady when he thrashed. He did not sleep. He just watched and waited and willed him to live. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Caleb woke, his eyes clear for the first time in days. He was terribly weak, his skin ashen, but he was alive. He looked at Eli, his gaze filled with a weary, profound gratitude. He lifted a trembling hand and touched Eli's cheek, his fingers cool against Eli's skin. He pulled him closer, his strength surprising, and kissed him. It was a soft, fragile kiss, full of pain and relief. It was the kiss of a man who had walked to the edge of death and back. It felt like he was dying. "I didn't want to love you," Caleb whispered, his voice a dry rasp against Eli's lips. "But I do." The confession was a fragile, beautiful thing in the cold, damp air of the cave. Eli felt the truth of it resonate deep in his own soul, answering a question he had not dared to ask. He leaned his forehead against Caleb's, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Then live for me," Eli whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. Outside the mouth of the cave, a single, perfect snowflake drifted down, then another and another. The snow, their silent jailer, their constant witness, was beginning to fall again. The world became a blur of white. The snow that had begun to fall as they hid in the cave became a blizzard, an enemy, blinding and relentless. It erased their tracks, but it also threatened to bury them. They pushed on, 2 wounded figures against an indifferent landscape. Eli's leg was a grinding pain with every step, a constant, fiery protest. Caleb, weak from his wound and the lingering fever, was a fever-pale ghost at his side, leaning on him for support, his breathing often coming in ragged hitches. They were a pathetic sight, 2 broken men staggering south, their only guide the faint, watery sun they could sometimes glimpse through the swirling snow. Survival became a brutal, elemental calculus. The food they had packed was gone in 3 days. Hunger became a constant companion, a hollow ache that gnawed at their insides. Eli, drawing on a knowledge of the wild his father had beaten into him as a boy, set snares for rabbits, Most days, the snares were empty. On the days they were not, they would share the meager, stringy meat cooked hastily over a tiny, nearly smokeless fire of dry twigs they built in the shelter of a rock outcropping. The taste of it was the taste of life itself, a temporary victory against the encroaching emptiness. The cold was a more patient predator. It seeped through their worn clothes, chilling them to the bone. Frostbite gnawed at their fingers and toes, turning the skin a dead, waxy white. They huddled together for warmth at night, wrapped in their single, threadbare bedrolls, their bodies a shared furnace against the vast, freezing dark. Eli would often wake to find Caleb shivering violently in his sleep, his teeth chattering. He would pull the blankets tighter, his own body a shield against the cold, and listen to the wind howl like a hungry wolf outside their makeshift shelters. Caleb grew weaker. The wound in his shoulder, though no longer infected, was slow to heal, and the hardship of the journey drained what little strength he had regained. There were days he could barely walk, his face ashen, his silver eyes clouded with pain. On those days, Eli's own strength, born of a stubborn refusal to surrender, was all that kept them moving. He would find the deepest reserves of his will, forcing his own screaming muscles to obey, half carrying Caleb as they trudged through the deep snow. He walled off his own pain, building a dam against the fear that threatened to swamp him. He could not afford to be weak. If he fell, they both died. In the long, dark hours of the night, huddled by their small fires, they began to speak. The walls they had built around themselves, already breached by violence and desperation, began to crumble completely, worn away by shared suffering. They shared stories like men sharing their last rations of food, offering up small pieces of the lives they had lived before they were nothing but fugitives. Eli spoke of his childhood on the ranch, before his brother's death had poisoned everything. He told Caleb about his father, a hard, silent man who had nonetheless taken the time to teach him how to read the land, how to tell the track of a deer from that of a wolf, how to find water, how to predict the weather from the color of the sky. They were simple stories, tales of a quiet, orderly world that seemed a lifetime away. Caleb spoke of his mother. He had grown up in a small town in the east, in a house with a piano. His mother, he said, could make that piano sing. He described her hands on the keys, the way the music would fill the house, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She used to say that music was a prayer the body could understand. He never spoke of his father, or how he had ended up drifting west, a man with a steady hand for a knife and a haunted look in his eyes. But in his stories of his mother's music, Eli glimpsed the ghost of the boy Caleb had been, a boy who had known a different kind of beauty, a different kind of peace. After nearly 3 weeks of walking, they stumbled out of the mountains and into a high, wind-swept valley. They were on the edge of starvation, their faces gaunt, their clothes in tatters. In the distance, they saw the flicker of campfires. Eli's first instinct was to hide, to retreat back into the cover of the trees, but Caleb was leaning on him, his weight almost more than Eli could bear, and they had nothing left. No food, no strength, no hope but to walk toward those fires and pray that the people there were not looking for a reward. It was a small, ragged camp, a collection of 3 dilapidated wagons and a handful of tents huddled in a shallow basin, sheltered from the worst of the wind. As they drew closer, they saw the people. They were mostly black folk, ex-slaves who had fled the South after the war, and a few poor white families who looked as if they had been chewed up and spat out by the world. They were outcasts, people living on the very fringes of a society that had no place for them. They watched Eli and Caleb approach with wary, suspicious eyes. A tall man with skin the color of dark wood and graying temples stepped forward, a heavy axe held loosely in his hand. "State your business," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're not looking for trouble," Eli said, his voice a hoarse croak. He felt Caleb sag against him. "My friend, he's hurt. We need food, water. We can work. The man's eyes took in their condition: Eli's still bruised face, Caleb's pale, drawn features, their ragged clothes, the exhaustion that clung to them like a shroud. He looked at Caleb, and his hard expression softened with a flicker of something that looked like pity. "Bring him," he said, nodding toward one of the tents. They were kind people, suspicious at first, but kind. They shared what little they had without question. A woman brought them a hot, thick stew of rabbit and roots that was the best thing Eli had ever tasted. They were given a space in a tent to sleep, on a bed of hay that felt as soft as a feather mattress. For the first time in weeks, they were warm and safe. They stayed for 4 days. The rest was a balm to their weary bodies and frayed spirits. The wounds on Eli's face began to fade, the deep ache in his legs subsiding to a dull throb. Caleb began to regain some of his color, the feverish, haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet, weary gratitude. They helped with chores, Eli chopping wood, his strength returning with the simple, familiar work, and Caleb, his shoulders still too stiff for heavy labor, mending harnesses with slow, careful stitches. An old woman named Esther, the tall man's mother, would sometimes come and sit by them as they worked. She had eyes that seemed to see right through a man, to the very marrow of his soul. She rarely spoke, but her presence was a comforting, steady thing. On their 3rd day there, she was watching as Eli adjusted a bandage on Caleb's shoulder. Their hands touched, and for a moment, their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between them, a look that was more intimate than any touch. Esther smiled, a slow, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She leaned forward and murmured, her voice a soft, dry whisper like rustling leaves. "The world is full of hardship, but even out here, God sees the truth." Her words were not a judgment. They were a simple, profound acceptance. She saw them, not as outlaws or sinners, but as 2 men bound together by something she recognized as true. In her eyes, they were not judged. They were simply seen. On their last evening in the camp, Caleb gave Eli a gift. He had been working on it in secret, using a small whittling knife one of the men had lent him. He pressed it into Eli's hand. It was a small wooden horse, carved from a piece of pine. It was not perfect. The lines were a little rough, the proportions slightly off, but it was solid, real. It was the mare from the barn, her head turned, her ears alert. It was the only gift Caleb had to offer, a small, tangible piece of his gratitude, of his heart. Eli closed his hand around it, the smooth wood warm against his palm. He did not have the words to say what he felt, so he just nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. The next morning, it was time to leave. The tall man, whose name was Josiah, approached them. "We're moving on west," he said. "You're welcome to come with us. There's safety in numbers." Eli was tempted. The thought of companionship, of not being constantly alone and hunted, was a powerful lure. But he knew they could not. Sooner or later, a lawman or a bounty hunter would come sniffing around, and he would not bring that trouble down on these people who had shown them nothing but kindness. "We appreciate the offer," Eli said, "but we have to keep moving south." They had a problem. They had no horses. They could not keep walking, not if they wanted to outrun the law. Eli had only one thing of value left in the world. He unwrapped the oilcloth bundle he had carried on his back for weeks. It was his father's rifle, a heavy, long-barreled Winchester, its stock worn smooth from years of use. It was the last piece of his old life, the last tangible link to his family. He found one of the white men in the camp, a trapper named Silas, who was planning on heading north. The man's eyes lit up when he saw the rifle. They bartered. The rifle, a box of cartridges, and the last of Eli's father's tools in exchange for 2 sturdy, if ugly, horses and 2 old saddles. He handed the rifle over, the weight of it a phantom limb in his hands. It felt like he was trading away his own history, but as he looked over at Caleb, who was waiting for him by the new horses, He knew it was a trade he had to make. He did not look back. They rode south, always south. The horses made the travel easier, but the fear returned. They were exposed now, out in the open. Every rider they saw on a distant ridge, every curl of smoke from a far-off chimney, was a potential threat. They rode hard during the day and slept in cold camps at night, always on watch. Word travels fast in the West, carried by telegraph wires and gossiping tongues in dusty saloons. The story of the murderer, Caleb Wyatt, and the rancher who helped him escape, of the burning ranch and the dead lawman, had spread. The bounty on Caleb's head was now a legend, a sum that could make a poor man rich. And there were a lot of poor, hungry men in that country, men who were not afraid to kill for money. They were not just running from the law anymore. They were running from the ghouls and vultures that preyed on the unfortunate. They were ambushed at a frozen creek. They had stopped to water the horses at twilight, the world a landscape of gray and blue shadows. They were careless, tired from a long day's ride. The first sign of trouble was a glint of metal on the rocks above them. The first shot kicked up a spray of icy water next to Caleb's horse. The second tore through the sleeve of his coat. 2 men came scrambling down the rocks, their faces lean and hungry in the dying light. Bounty hunters. Eli reacted without thinking. He drew his pistol and fired, the sound of the shot unnaturally loud in the quiet twilight. One of the men grunted and went down, but the other kept coming, leveling his rifle at Caleb. There was no time to aim, no time to think. There was only Caleb, his face a pale target in the gloom, and the man with the rifle about to kill him. Eli fired again. The man staggered, a look of surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Silence. The echo of the gunshots faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and the nervous stamping of the horses. Eli walked forward on shaky legs. The 2 men were dead. The one he had shot last lay on his back, his eyes open, staring up at the first few uncaring stars that had begun to appear in the darkening sky. He was young, no older than 20. Eli stared down at the boy's face, at the life he had just extinguished. He had killed men before, in his youth, in saloon brawls and range disputes. But it had been a long time. This felt different. This killing was a cold, deliberate act. It was the price of Caleb's life, and it shattered something deep inside him. The world tilted on its axis, the lines between right and wrong, between justice and murder, blurring into a meaningless gray smudge. That night, they rode on for miles before they dared to make camp. Eli moved like a man in a trance, his hands performing the familiar tasks of unsaddling the horses and building a fire. But his mind was far away, back at that frozen creek, staring into a dead boy's eyes. He sat by the fire, his body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable shudder. It was not from the cold. It was the aftershock of the violence, the tremor of a soul that had been irrevocably broken. Caleb came and sat beside him, putting a blanket around his shoulders. "I'm not a good man," Eli whispered, the words a confession torn from the deepest part of him. He looked at Caleb, his eyes filled with a terrible self-loathing. "I killed them." Caleb looked at him, his own face etched with a profound sorrow. He reached out and took Eli's trembling hand in his own, his grip firm and steady. "You're mine," Caleb said, his voice quiet but absolute. "That's enough." The snows melted and gave way to a vast, unforgiving country of red rock and dust. They rode south into the borderlands, a sun-blasted landscape where the law was thin and a man's life was worth whatever he could defend with a gun. The world had changed from a palette of white and gray to one of ochre and burnt sienna. The cold that had tried to freeze them to death was replaced by a relentless sun that baked the very moisture from the air and cracked the earth into a mosaic of fissures. They were ghosts in a strange land, their faces weathered and burned by the sun, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The past was a shadow that clung to them, long and dark in the harsh sunlight. Eli's limp from the bullet in his calf had eased into a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the burning ranch. Caleb's shoulder had healed, but it had left him with a stiffness that made him favor his right side. The wounds on their bodies were mending, but the wounds on their souls were another matter. Eli, the man who had killed at the frozen creek, was quieter now, a new hardness in his eyes. The easy silence they had once shared was now filled with a different kind of tension, the wariness of men who knew that peace was a luxury they could no longer afford. They knew they were being hunted. Sometimes they would see a lone rider on a distant mesa, a dark silhouette against the vast sky, watching them. Other times, in the small, dusty towns where they stopped for supplies, they would feel the weight of curious, greedy eyes. The story had followed them south. $1,000 was a king's ransom in this hard country, and it made every man they met a potential enemy. The end came in a place called Diablo Canyon. It was a jagged scar in the earth, a maze of red rock walls and sudden drop-offs. They had been followed for 2 days by a posse, a relentless, patient pursuit that had worn their horses and their nerves down to a raw edge. They had tried to lose them in the Badlands, but the trackers were good. They were herded, driven like cattle toward a final, inevitable confrontation. The canyon was a trap, a dead end, and they both knew it. They made their stand in a box canyon, a natural amphitheater of stone with only one way in or out. They dismounted behind a jumble of fallen rocks that offered some meager cover, their horses panting, their sides heaving. Eli checked his revolver, the 6 rounds in the cylinder feeling like a pitifully small defense against the world. Caleb stood beside him, his rifle in his hands, his face grim, his silver eyes scanning the canyon entrance. "I'm sorry, Eli," Caleb said, his voice low. "I never should have let you cut me down from that post." "No point in looking back now," Eli said, his voice rough. "We knew this day was coming." He looked at Caleb, at the hard, determined line of his jaw. The love he felt for this man was a fierce, painful ache in his chest, a single point of warmth in a world gone cold. He reached out and touched Caleb's arm. "We see this through, together." Caleb nodded, a flicker of a sad smile on his lips. Together. The posse came, not with a wild charge, but with a slow, deliberate certainty. There were 6 of them, including Silas Croft from back in Redemption. They fanned out, taking positions behind the rocks opposite them, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. The first shots echoed in the canyon, the bullets kicking up dust and whining off the rocks around them. It was a desperate, hopeless fight. They were pinned down, outnumbered, outgunned. They fired back sparingly, making every shot count, trying to keep the posse at bay. For an hour, the canyon was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and hot metal. A bullet grazed Eli's arm, a hot, searing line of pain. Then Caleb cried out. It was a sharp, guttural sound of pain that cut through the noise of the battle. Eli turned and saw him on the ground, clutching his side, a dark stain spreading through his shirt. Before Eli could react, another shot slammed into Caleb, this one high in his chest, throwing him back against the rocks. A wave of pure, white-hot rage washed over Eli. He stood up from behind the rocks, firing his revolver with a wild, desperate fury, giving no thought to his own safety. He just wanted to kill the men who had shot Caleb. A bullet tore through the flesh of his thigh, and he went down, his leg collapsing under him. The shooting stopped, in the ringing silence. Eli crawled to Caleb. He was conscious, his breathing a shallow, bloody gasp. His silver eyes were wide with shock and pain. "Go, Eli!" Caleb rasped, his hand weakly trying to push him away. "Leave me." "I'm not leaving you," Eli said, his voice a broken whisper. He grabbed Caleb under the arms and began to drag him farther back, behind a larger rock outcropping, away from the prying eyes of the posse. It was an agony. His own leg was on fire, and Caleb was a dead weight. Every inch was a struggle. He had just pulled him into cover when a new figure appeared at the mouth of the canyon. A lone rider on a big black horse. Marshal Thompson. He rode forward slowly, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had come to savor his victory. He dismounted, his shotgun held loosely in his hand, and walked toward the rocks where the rest of his posse was gathered. He stood there, looking across the open ground to where Eli was hidden with the dying man he had given up everything to protect. "It's over, Granger!" the marshal's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "You have nowhere left to run. Throw out your weapon!" Eli did not move. He was crouched over Caleb, trying to staunch the bleeding from the wound in his chest. But it was no use. There was too much blood. Caleb's life was spilling out into the red dust of the canyon floor. "I know you can hear me. Granger!" Thompson shouted again. "I'll offer you a deal. A kindness, seeing as you were once a decent man. You push the killer Wyatt out from behind that rock. You give him to me, and I'll let you live. I'll tell them you helped us in the end. You can walk away from this, a free man." The offer was so cruel, so perfectly designed to break him, that Eli almost laughed. Walk away? Free? There was no freedom without Caleb. There was no life. He looked down at Caleb's face, pale and slick with sweat, his eyes beginning to glaze over. He was dying. All this running, all this fighting, had been for nothing. The world had won. Eli leaned down, his lips close to Caleb's ear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He felt a profound and terrible sense of failure. He had sworn he would not let Caleb die alone, and now he was going to die right here, in his arms. He looked up, across the dusty ground, at the figure of Marshal Thompson. The man was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. The cruel, self-righteous certainty, the mob justice, the hatred for anything that did not fit into a narrow, prescribed box. He was the devil that had haunted their steps from the very beginning. Eli's voice was a low, rasping whisper, meant only for himself and the dying man beside him. But the words were a clear echo of another time, another plea. "Please, just make it quick." He stared into the marshal's eyes, a look of utter, final surrender on his face. Thompson smiled, a predator savoring the kill. He began to walk forward, confident that the fight was over. But it was not surrender in Eli's eyes. It was a promise. As Thompson stepped into the open ground, Eli moved. It was not a thought. It was a pure, animal instinct, a final desperate act of love and rage. His hand, slick with Caleb's blood, found the grip of his revolver. He drew and fired in one smooth, continuous motion. The movement was fast, righteous, furious. The shot was perfect. Marshal Thompson stopped, a look of pure, stupid surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, as if he could not comprehend what had happened. Then his shotgun slipped from his fingers, and he fell face first into the dust. Silence. A profound, absolute silence fell over the canyon. The posse, Silas Croft and the others, stood frozen, their rifles lowered. They had just watched a wounded, broken man kill their leader. They looked from the marshal's body to the rocks where Eli was hidden. They were 5 men against 1, but they did not move. They had seen something in Eli's eyes, in that final, impossible shot. That was beyond their understanding. They had seen the righteous fury of a man with nothing left to lose. Slowly, without a word, Silas Croft lowered his rifle completely. He turned and walked to his horse, one by one. The others followed his lead. No one helped. No one stopped them. They mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving their dead marshal behind in the dust. They had come for a bounty, not for a war. Eli watched them go, his mind a numb void. He turned back to Caleb. His eyes were closed now, his breathing almost non-existent, but he was still alive. Barely, with the last of his strength. Eli stood, his own legs screaming in protest. He lifted Caleb, a terrible, bloody weight, and somehow, through sheer force of will, he got him onto the back of his horse. Flint, he pulled himself up into the saddle behind him, holding Caleb's limp body against his own. He rode out of that canyon of death, leaving the bodies and the blood behind. He did not look back. Bleeding, both of them barely alive. They rode east, into the rising sun. They were broken and burning, but they were free. Months passed like water sinking into dry earth. The harsh memory of the borderlands faded, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic sound of the sea. They had made it to Mexico, to a small, forgotten fishing village on the coast, a place where no one knew their names or cared about their past. They bought a small, run-down farm just outside the village, a few acres of land with a small adobe house that overlooked the vast, blue expanse of the ocean. The air smelled of salt and flowers. The days were quiet, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. They lived as ghosts, but they lived. Caleb walked with a permanent limp now, a reminder of the bullets he had taken in the canyon. The wound in his chest had healed into a puckered, ugly scar. But the haunted, hunted look was gone from his eyes. He spent his days by the sea, carving intricate shapes from pieces of driftwood he found on the shore. His hands, once so deadly, now creating things of simple beauty. Eli worked the land. The rage that had fueled him for so long was slowly being replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He built new fences to keep the goats out of their garden. He learned to grow tomatoes and peppers in the sandy soil. His hands, once stained with blood, now stained with the good. Clean dirt. He found a quiet satisfaction in the simple, honest labor, in the act of creation rather than destruction. They were two scarred men, living a life of profound and gentle silence. They had found their sanctuary, not in a fortress, but in a quiet, shared existence. They had found their peace. One night, they were sitting on the small porch of their house, watching the stars come out over the dark water. A fire was burning in a small clay pit, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. "You know," Caleb said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the flames, "I'd still let you kiss me first, even if it meant the devil was watching." Eli looked at him, at the man he had pulled from the jaws of hell, the man who had pulled him from an even deeper darkness. He reached out and took his hand, their fingers lacing together, a comfortable, familiar gesture. He said nothing. He did not need to. The feeling between them was a quiet, steady flame, a light that no darkness, no devil, could ever extinguish. Thank you for listening to our story at the Wild West Campfire. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in English.